Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm going to preside over the fifth Lyceum Debate entitled, Do Abstract Objects Exist? So, Mathoma, since you will be defending the proposition, we will begin with you, and you have 10 minutes starting now.
All right, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Classical Theist, for defending the opposite position tonight. So I'm going to be defending the metaphysical realist position, which says that abstract objects are real and not merely reducible to individual chunks of matter or individual things, and they're not constructions that the mind just conjures up. Now, what I mean by abstract is that they're removed or drawn away from the particulars, and particulars are just individual things. Now, it's going to be an interesting discussion because this is a classical philosophical problem going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, both of whom were realists, I should point out. Now, the problem seems to me to be how to develop an account of how it is that we experience things which are simultaneously different, but also the same in some respect. That is, many different triangles, for example, but also share something in common. So they're the same in some respect. We're going to be using that example of triangles throughout the debate tonight just because it's an easy example, but it applies more generally too. Now, this is not just something we need to understand in our common experience, but also in high-level science, because we often say things that, for example, two atoms are alike in some respect, but still different, such as two different instances of a carbon atom. Or there are different electrons, but they are still particular instances of something which seems to unite the two and makes us say that they're both electrons. Now, there are two main arguments I'd like to present for the truth of metaphysical realism. I call them the one over many argument. Actually, this is always called a one over many argument. And secondly, from mathematical knowledge, from the nature of mathematical knowledge. So let me start with the one over many argument. Now, in our experience, we see triangles of many different colors drawn using different matter, for example, chalk or ink. We also see many different types of triangles, like equilateral or scalene or what have you. Now, in spite of this diversity of triangles, there seems to be something in common which all triangles share, even though they are nonetheless particular. Now, that they share something in common is quite clear because we recognize them as instances of something, namely triangles, by putting them under the class called triangle, instead of seeing them as totally individualized and distinct, having absolutely nothing to do with one another. Therefore, there seems to be something in common between them. There seems to be something just reflecting on our experience with triangles, which is common or one over the many individuals which fall under this universal. That is, the universal triangularity is common to all of those individuals within the class, under which the universal universalizes. It universalizes over these individuals, leaving aside all of the particularizing matters like the color of the triangle, the matter out of which it's composed, the angles within the triangle, and precisely contains that which they all share in spite of their particularizing features. Now, this universal triangularity isn't simply reducible to the sum of the individuals within the class, for all triangles could go out of existence, and this universal could come to be instantiated once again should someone draw a new triangle. Furthermore, the universal of triangularity just cannot be the same thing as the particulars precisely because individual triangles have particularizing features, such as being red or green or isosceles or equilateral or what have you, whereas the universal has none of these particularizing features. Now, since the universal differs in this respect from the individuals, lacking all of those individual features, there's no way it could be the same thing as the individuals or even any collection of individuals, since those two will also have individualizing features, which universals simply don't have. The universal also isn't dependent upon the existence of contingent beings, such as ourselves, since we could all go out of existence, and the universal of triangularity could also come to be instantiated in some other way, as a particular triangle, even though we may never know about it. So it seems to me that these universals which we pick out of our daily experience with particulars are real things over and above the particulars which cannot be destroyed by suppressing those particulars, and are not mere construction. They're not mere constructions of our contingent minds. So that's my first argument for the truth of the realist position. The second one, I'd like to argue from the nature of mathematical knowledge. Now, furthermore, it is clear that we have mathematical knowledge about not just particular triangles, but triangularity as such. And this is revealed in such theorems as the Pythagorean theorem, which applies not just to this or that individual right triangle, but to all right triangles. Now, I say that if there were no universals, as the anti-realist claims, we would never really have any mathematical knowledge about things like triangularity as such, only individual triangles. And mathematics would be turned into a sort of physics, where instead of being able to absolutely prove theorems, we'd only be able to hypothesize about particular right triangles and make probabilistic statements. But I say mathematics just isn't like this. We do indeed have the ability to absolutely prove statements and have knowledge about things like triangularity as such, which is logically necessary in our theorems about triangles. Therefore, the anti-realist has to be incorrect, and there must really be universals such as triangularity. Furthermore, the logical necessity of such knowledge rules out a position known as conceptualism, which would say that these abstract objects are merely constructs of our mind, which they cannot be because our minds are contingent and changing, not necessary in their nature. Now, I use triangularity because, again, it's an easy example, as I said above. But this argument applies more generally in the empirical sciences, such as physics, where I claim that we do have mathematical theories about particles, such as electrons, which are not merely saying something about this or that particular electron, but getting at a common nature that all the electrons seem to share. Not just the particulars. I would say that these abstract theories owe their predictive power from this ability to go above and beyond the particulars. And they're abstracting away from the particulars to get at that common nature that all electrons share, and then returning to the particulars from the abstract to actually do calculations concerning individual electrons. So I think the realist position is not only supported by this argument from mathematical knowledge and the one over many argument, but is actually quite harmonious with how we reason about the world, from the level of common sense all the way up to the level of mathematical physics. On the other hand, the anti-realist position, particularly the nominalistic position, in the way that it denies universals and says that things are radically individualized, I claim is quite hostile to abstract reasoning. I'd like to present two arguments against the truth of nominalism. The first is what I call the self-refutation by appealing to a universal to set up the position. I claim that there are arguments to show that not only is nominalism implausible, but it's incoherent. Now, this is the view that all we're doing when we see many instances of triangles is not, as the realist says, seeing them as instances of a universal, but slapping the name triangle, quote unquote, onto each one. So the nominalist is going to deny the reality of universals and other abstracta. This emphasis on names over abstract is right in the name, in the Latin name, nomen, meaning name. The first argument against nominalism is simply from the smuggling in of universals to set the nominalist's own position. Notice that the nominalist says that when we see individuals within a class, like particular triangles falling under a class triangularity, or particular electrons falling under the universal electron, what we're doing is something similar in both cases, both in triangles and electrons, and we're attaching the same names to those individuals. But what is this name stuff the nominalist is talking about, if not a universal, something that is common over all the particulars, over and above the particulars? Furthermore, when we attach the same name to each individual, such as slap the name man, quote unquote, onto Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, it has to be the same name. But what is this same stuff, if not, again, a universal, something in common shared over and above the particulars? There's no way the novelist can just say that this name man isn't really the same name when attached to Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. This is just preposterous if he says it's not the same name. Clearly, it is the same name, that is man. So it seems that the novelist is smuggling in universals just to articulate his own position. And because of the smuggling in of universals, I say that as soon as the nominalistic position is set up, it's refuted. Now, there also seems to be a problem with what I say is the infinite regress by appealing to similarities. Now, the second argument against nominalism is that it seems to never quite say why it is that when I see two instances of triangle or two men, I slap the same name onto each one of the individuals. That is, when I see an equilateral triangle and a right triangle, why do I name them both triangles? Or when I see Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, do I slap the name man onto each one? There's obviously something in the individuals that makes me do that in a non-fortuitous, non-arbitrary way. Now, the nominalist can just say that I'm recognizing a similarity between individuals, and that's why I slap the common name onto each one of them. That is, there's a similarity among the triangles and also a similarity among the men that makes me do this. But what is this similarity that the nominalist is appealing to, if not a universal? Something that's common to all over and above the individual cases. It seems the nominalist has gotten himself into precisely the one over many situation he's trying to avoid. Now, the nominalist could say that what a similarity, quote unquote, is just another name, but this higher order naming does the nominalist no good and simply pushes the problem back one step. For why do we recognize those similarities among individuals as having something in common and name them all with the common higher order name? He can try to escape this by proposing a yet higher order similarity, but this just renders nominalism incoherent by infinite regress. And the nominalist can never escape this by postulating ever higher orders of names and similarities for things. What he needs is a universal, which is precisely the thing he's trying to avoid and precisely the sorts of things I, as a realist, claim are real. Now, my opponent might try to appeal to ideas like not postulating universals beyond necessity, like Occam's razor, or we don't really need universals because we can just focus on individuals and ignore the abstracta. But if these arguments against nominalism work, nominalism is false, it's dead in the water, and it can't even get off the ground.
Okay,
and of course,
Todd,
if the argument... Thank you.
Thank you, Mathoma. Classical Theist, you now have 10 minutes starting now.
Okay, so my first argument for the anti-realist would be as follows. As we both agree, I would think, nothing is in the intellect which is not first in the senses. But, in accordance with Occam's razor, we ought not multiply causes beyond necessity. But the particularized sense data is all we have immediate contact with in the process of sense perception. Therefore, there is no evidence for immaterial universals, since this would require an additional investigation that would go beyond sense experience itself, which we do not have access to. Therefore, there is no evidence for realism. My second argument is that immaterial abstract objects seem to be better accounted for by the fact that common concepts resemble each other in their particularized instantiations. There are, for example, two instantiations that we both refer to as a dog, but the fact that we call both instantiations by the same name seems to refer to nothing more than the fact that such things are similar, and we simply recognize the similarity. Beyond this, we are just speculating. The third argument is as follows. It would run counter to the divine omnipotence if God were required to model the universe according to pre-existent abstract objects. These abstract objects would seem to put a limit on God's power because he would be chained, in a sense, to these pre-existent models of reality as preconditions for his providence. Therefore, there are no abstract objects. And the fourth argument, I realize I'm running through these rather quickly, but the fourth one, I'm just stating the arguments here. The fourth argument I have is that if you are to say that there are these common universals, then there would seem to call out for an infinite regress, because if you have the notion of universal, and multiple universals are common as universals, then there would seem to be a higher order of universals that would have to account for the universality of the universal. But of course, if you do that, then we have to push back a step and say that there is some universal for the universalizing principle that binds together these things that we all call universals, and et cetera, et cetera. You see the infinite regress. And that would seem to render realism incoherent if the argument holds. I think I'm going to yield the time because I've had these already written out, and I figured I would just state them, and then we can proceed.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So now, Classical Theist, your 5 minutes of rebuttal begin starting now.
Okay, so the first thing I would say is that he defined a universal as something that is removed from particulars, but that seems to be ill-defined, because I think one would have to give an account for how it is that the particular can interact with the universal. This seems to me to be ill-defined, and hence there is a term in the argument that requires a succinct definition. Furthermore, in response to his hang on a second here. Oh yeah, in response to his one over many argument, isn't there another alternative that perhaps that for example, with the example of triangularity, couldn't all that exists simply be the particularized arrangements of the shall we say drawn out lines that are brought together in similar patterns, and that these patterns that we recognize as similar patterns, we just simply slap the label of triangularity onto them. But with respect to triangularity itself, it seems to me that it would be simply sufficient to refer to the arrangement of lines that are put together in according to similar patterns. let's see, what else we got here? He also referred to the nature of mathematical language and said that if we don't adopt a realism about mathematical objects, then math would simply be reduced to physics. And if math is simply reduced to physics, then the absolute nature of mathematics would be would then reduce to probabilistic hypotheses. I see no reason why this, from what was said, I see no reason why this is necessarily an undesirable position, because we would then simply have to retreat to the idea that our mathematical knowledge is only absolute relative to our spatio-temporal processes that attempt to model physical reality according to preset rules of quantitative processes that would be within the mind, not necessarily out there in extrinsic reality. Let's see. I think that's. Oh yeah. Oh, he also it seemed to beg the question. What, like back when he was referring to triangularity, he seemed to beg the question on a common triangularity, because he assumed that we have this common identical conception of a triangle, and that identical conception is the basis for why we have to appeal to the universal. But that doesn't itself sufficiently prove the notion that it is identical. I see no reason to think why our recognition of triangular patterns, why my recognition and say Mathoma's recognition, why that has to be absolutely identical. Why couldn't they just resemble each other according to the patterns that we see in reality? And I think that's good from the rebuttal.
Right.
That's kind of all I've written down.
Thank you. All right, Mathoma, your 5-minute rebuttal begins starting now.
All right, thank you, Todd. So there are a number of points that Classical Theist brought up with regards to nominalism and some of the arguments I made in my opening. Well, first, let me point out that I issued 2 arguments against nominalism. I'm not sure that these are quite being dealt with in Classical Theist's conception of nominalism. Remember, those 2 arguments were the self-refutation of just the position of self, the position itself, and that it has to appeal to universals just to even get off the ground. It has to appeal to things like names. And we see in his rebuttal that he has to use terms, general terms like interaction, patterns, commonalities. He's trying to grasp at a universal, but it doesn't seem that he's allowing this into his system. So I still think the charge of just a self-refutation of this position still stands. And the argument from infinite regress among these similarities, I don't think it's really been addressed. I think he mentioned this by saying that we label things accordingly because we recognize a similarity, but then speculating after that point, or something along those lines, that we just speculate. But then our knowledge of the world quite mysterious. I mean, when I recognize 2 electrons, for example, it's not just a bunch of speculation that we label those 2 as electrons, for example. I mean, if it were just a bunch of speculation, that seems to wreck all of our knowledge that we have about things like electrons and anything which is individualized, that we try to group into the same thing. So, I mean, it seems like science, and I mean science in the broadest sense, and knowledge, it seems to be rather impossible to obtain here, because I guess we're just speculating about these similarities. Let's see here. I think he charged me with begging the question on the one over many argument. But what I'm saying here is that just to make sense out of our experience, we have to recognize these universals which go above and beyond the particular set. What I'm basing this off of is just our experience of, we really do label things like triangles and electrons in a non-fortuitous and non-arbitrary way, and we recognize them as instances of something. So it's that experience that we have that I'm really appealing to. There were a couple of other arguments that he presented in his opening. One was from Occam's razor. I'd like to also point out in that argument, he was dropping an additional assumption about empiricism, that he was assuming that we have to take on like a Humean or Lockean empiricism where all we really have is just sense data. But I'm not sure why one has to adopt this naive sort of empiricism where all we have is sense data. I mean, it seems to me we can do a lot more. Our experience is much more structured than just like pixels being presented as sense data. I mean, it seems to me that we can actually draw from the particulars to have intellectual grasps of things. And this is evidence in the knowledge that we have both in mathematics and physics. We can take basic experience, but we can draw a lot from that. So I'm not sure why we have to adopt this naive empiricism. I'm not sure if he's going to present an argument for that. He also appealed to Occam's razor, which I mean, that requires an additional argument itself to actually defend that one. Let's see. He also appealed to divine omnipotence, that perhaps if we had these universals as a claim, this would limit God's omnipotence. I mean, this seems a little bit off topic for this debate because we're not really discussing the existence of God. I'm not sure within this debate we even assume God's existence at all. I mean, this could be addressed, but I think it's rather. I mean, he hasn't presented a case for God's existence, so I'm not sure what relevance this has exactly. And I think that was more or less all I have. One more point too. I think I was charged with this infinite regress of universals within my position. I accuse his position of infinite regress, but he's claiming that there's an infinite regress in my position. Now, this might be a good argument against something like a Platonic realism, where I'm saying these universals are forms or something like that, but I haven't argued for that position at all. Now, what I would say in response to that is that there are other forms of realism which we could just as well take on, like an Aristotelian or a scholastic realism, in which universals are inherent in the particulars as well. The form of triangularity is inherent also in particular triangles as well, and also as an idea in the intellect, in which it doesn't seem like it would run into this sort of problem. And I think that's all I had to say for my rebuttal.
All right. Thank you, Mathoma. You have 10 minutes of cross-examination beginning now.
Yeah, so Classical Theist, I was just curious, under your nominalistic position, it seems that, well, in my rebuttal, I was charging you with the idea that science and knowledge in the general sense seems to be rather impossible under this nominalistic conception of things, where we're just speculating about similarities that we seem to experience. What do you say in response to this, that it seems like science would be kind of impossible under this nominalism?
Yeah, well, I don't see why science itself would be impossible, even if it was just reduced to a recognition of similitude in reference to the patterns that we see in reality. That is to say, the quantitative arrangements of matter and energy that we can observe in the world. We can still make we can still construct mathematical models based on that observation, and construct accurate predictions based on that observation, even if we have to stay silent on the qualitative dimension of that process, which I think which I think universals would bear relevance to, only in that qualitative camp, not in the quantitative.
Okay, so like supposing we were doing some physics about like electrons and also about things like protons. So under your conception of here, all we'd be doing is like recognize a similarity among those electrons, but also some similarity among the protons too.
Right. Well, the mathematical similarities. And I think that it's the mathematical similarities, the mathematical patterns that we derive from the data. Correct. I mean it, and we subsequent to that we apply qualitative terms to ascribe to those mathematical models.
But it's like the same sort of thing you're doing in each of those particular cases, like when you study quote unquote electrons and protons, you're doing like a similar sort of procedure.
Yeah.
But this seems to be I mean, it seems to be a problem for your nominalist position because you can't allow anything like similarities like this into your conception, because that seems to be universal, would it not?
The activity would be a universal. The activity of going through the process would be a universal. That seems to be just a collection of individuated actions which we experience.
Yeah, I mean, see, the problem I'm having with your position is that, like, when you use terms like collection and similarity and patterns, are these not just universals? I guess I'm having trouble understanding.
Well, that's just the recognition of phenomena. That's just the coming together of sense perception and phenomenal reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's a coming together, but I guess I'm just stuck with the basic question, like, why do we? But you deny that these are universals, right? Like the similitude and patterns.
On the anti-realist position, they would not be universals.
Yeah, but why do we lump things together in the same collection or same class if there aren't any of these universals? I guess I'm just stuck with that basic question. Like, when I see like a bunch of individual triangles, why do I call them all triangles? Why not just like triangle and then cat and dog? Why do I recognize all of these as falling under a common class, though?
Well, it would seem to me that on this position, one would have to there may not be an objective extramental reason that simply goes beyond the mere recognition of extramental objects operating according to similar patterns. And these similar patterns are simply could simply be reducible to the individuated arrangements of matter on a more fundamental level in physics.
So it seems in that position that so there might just be no reason at all why we lump them all together into like a common class.
That may be owed to our perceptual processes.
But again, like all these terms that you're using, a perceptual process, and you just said a moment ago, these arrangements, like those aren't meant to be like common terms or anything. But those are also like,
well, they're common terms. They're certainly common terms. We use these terms to designate to designate different phenomena that behave according to similar patterns. But there's that it seems to me that there would require an additional argument beyond simply a restatement of our own perceptual faculties to then take the next step and say that we're going to actually reify these common terms as existent on their own, in their own right.
Yeah, I think there are a couple other questions I had for you. Let me see if I can pull these up here. So I think earlier on in the debate, so I guess I've been generally charging you with this idea that you have to set up, you have to appeal to something like a universal just to set up your own position. Like you have to appeal to common things like names, and we've been saying all along arrangements, all these sorts of things, patterns. So, so you deny this charge that nominalism is just it doesn't have to appeal to anything which is universal, just to set itself up.
Well, when I use the term pattern, um, again, just because we use a common word for stuff acting according to similar modes of being, I don't see how that would necessarily require me to reify the term pattern as some kind of existent universal. One could just reduce it down to the actual things in the universe acting along various modes of being that we can group together as being more or less closer to one another.
And when you say similar modes of being, again, that's not something that you're trying to recognize in common, or similar modes of being. But also, when you say patterns, like the pattern here and then the pattern there, those have nothing in common with each other. Like a pattern amongst the electrons, the pattern amongst the protons.
Well, it would just be the
what are those?
Localized state of. I mean, wouldn't it? It's just a recognition of this being arranged in this way and this being arranged in that way, and some of these arrangements are closer to each other than others. And when we use the word arrangement, I mean, if I point to a pile of rocks, referring to that pile of rocks as an arrangement is simply in reference to the objects themselves intrinsically, not to some existent reality of arrangement, qua arrangement.
I do have one last question for you. So under this nominalistic scheme, like when you use the term triangle and when I use the term triangle, like as a name, do we have any guarantee that we're actually referring to the same thing here? Or, I mean, if there's no guarantee that we're referring to the same thing, it seems like knowledge is rather impossible in this view. Because, for example, if when I speak about triangle is different than when you speak about triangle, how could we know things like the Pythagorean theorem?
Well, I mean, it would just be probabilistic. Well, one could say that that's how all of our knowledge is probabilistic, based upon.
So there could be a right triangle. There could be a right triangle which just violates the Pythagorean theorem in the future. Like a Euclidean triangle is just violates.
Well, no,
just
because
outright violates the Pythagorean theorem.
Well, one could say that our mathematical constructs are absolute relative to our spatiotemporal processes, and we have no clear evidence that our knowledge can extend beyond that and remain absolute.
Thank you. Now, since you forfeited a little bit of time earlier, Classical Theist, would you like me to add a little more time to your cross-examination, or are you okay with the basic 10 minutes?
No, I'm okay with whatever I have.
Okay, so you have 10 minutes beginning now.
Okay, so one of the things that I'll stick to is my fourth argument that the universal universals in common would require a higher, on the realist view, would require a higher universal principle by which universals can be grouped together as universals. You replied to this by saying that I was essentially accusing you of Platonism. Now, I do realize, of course, that there are other brands of realism besides exaggerate the Platonic realism. There's Aristotelian moderate realism. There's Suarezian realism. There's, which could be argued to be conceptualism, but we won't go there. My argument wasn't so much to accuse you of Platonic realism, but to say that if you're going to reify universals at all, then if these multiple universals are in any way the same or common as universals, then by the same logic, you would have to you would have to group these universals together by a common universal principle by which we can understand them as universals. But then you would have to exceed for an infinite regress. What do you say in response to that?
Well, again, I don't think that universals just outright exist all by themselves. I mean, I've been making the case for like a general realism here, but again, I wouldn't adopt this Platonic realism.
But aren't they still real?
The universals are real in some respect. They're real in some respect.
In what respect? In what respect are they real? If not, yeah. But by what distinction exactly are you using here?
Well, I would say that they're inherent in actual things, either in actual things or as something in the intellect.
Right. Well, that would.
I'm not appealing to anything like higher order.
Exist. But that would explain the mode by which they exist as inherent in particular objects, but they would still seem to have a reality of themselves, would they not?
Reality of themselves? I mean, that's the sort of thing I'm denying that. Well, it seems like the Platonists would have to say something like that these real universals could have a reality of them of their own, like forms or something like that. I mean, I don't happen to think that the universal.
But it seems to me that if universals are to have any status of reality, then they would have to be subject to the same logic, because like what you were saying with respect to multiple triangles, these triangles share in common triangularity, which is to say that they are, insofar as they are all triangles, they are one and the same. Well, one could say that insofar as triangularity is a universal, and insofar as humanity is a universal, they are one and the same. But if they are one and the same, then you would seem to require an additional higher order of universality itself.
I mean, but all that is just from working as abstractions. I mean, I don't think universals, if universals exist at all, they're just as abstractions. They're not in actual things.
So they're in the mind, then, just in the mind.
I mean, they're just abstractions.
So that would be conceptualism, wouldn't it?
Well, no, it wouldn't just be conceptualism, because I was arguing before that our minds could be destroyed and there could still be instantiations of things like triangles.
But how could there be an abstraction if how could it be just an abstraction if it's not reducible to minds?
Well, no, it's not just an abstraction. The abstraction could be one way in which these universals might exist. They could be in an intellect, I would say, or they can be instantiated in actual things.
Right, but if they're instantiated in actual things, then they would still be have universality in common in actual things.
No, I wouldn't quite go that far to say that.
So how do we understand what a universal
I don't think that
is as a universal?
I don't think that additional universal is itself another thing which becomes instantiated in real things.
But then wouldn't the logic go out the window then that similitude necessitates universals? Because that seems to be the basis for realism.
Well, yeah, that was one argument I presented, that we see things being grouped under common classes, like we see triangles and such. But it's just at that level, I'm not appealing to something higher order and saying that that additionally is inherent in actual things.
Oh, I understand you're not appealing to that, but I was saying that seems to be a logical consequence. If you use the same logic to derive universals from similitude, then there would still be that similitude between universals as universals.
I think it's more similitude of actual things, though, like actual
But then, that seems
material things
isn't
and
that my
such.
argument though? If it's just similitude of instantiated objects, then why can't we just stop there?
Well, we can't stop there. I mean, our knowledge that we have knowledge of universal things like the Pythagorean theorem, so we can't just
Right.
stop there at the individuals.
It seems to.
I mean, I guess I
one
don't buy
could
that
argue that
assumption.
this is an all or nothing dichotomy, because if you say that universals are inherent in particular objects, and yet there is no, and we know that they are inherent in particular objects because the particular objects bear similarities, and that we derive commonality from similitude, and the commonality can only be understood as universality. Then we would still have to inquire as to by what means the universal of triangularity and the universal of redness and the universal of humanity are understood as one and the same concept, that is, of a universal.
Yeah, but well, I mean, perhaps as abstractions all by themselves.
Well,
I
what is
don't
an
think those
abstraction,
can.
though? Like, what does an abstraction have to have the universal? Multiple abstractions together as a being? And if you say that the multiple abstractions are a universal, then and if universals depend upon the concept of abstraction, then you have to still answer the question.
Yeah, but I'm just talking about the universals insofar as they are instantiated in real things, though.
That would, but if they're just instantiated in real things,
I mean, I'm not really going any further than that. I mean, that's the argument I'm drawing upon. I mean, I agree with your
right, but what
your
is
dictum that,
instantiated in real things? What is it that is instantiated in real things?
well, I mean,
Universal. But if you're saying that the universal is just an abstraction by itself, then we wouldn't really have to inquire as to the nature of abstraction.
well, again, I'm not giving like these abstractions like a I don't treat these as like independently existing forms, like all off by themselves, and then just using like the one over many argument upon that.
Yeah, but there would still seem to require to be a universal that would account for how these universals can be said to all commonly be abstractions.
Well, I would just say that the universals are just being derived from the real things. I mean, I think we were saying before, I agree with your dictum that what's in the intellect was first in the senses. I mean, I'm talking about
Yeah.
reality here.
Okay, well, now that we've talked, I suppose we can drop that point. Now that we've talked about the sort of empiricism that you just reiterated, you had said that you aren't obligated to accept the Humean sort of empiricism that I was advocating. Well, I wasn't actually advocating the Humean sort of empiricism. What I was specifically advocating seems to me to be in common between your position and this anti-realist position that I am defending. That is simply that what was first in the intellect, or what was first, or there's nothing in the intellect which was not first in the senses. So if there was nothing in the intellect which was not first in the senses, it still seems to me that we need an additional epistemological method to determine by what means we can know of these universals if all we can really come into contact with immediately are sense data is sense data. How can we extrapolate from all we have to work with something that is obviously not sense data?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, this would be a whole separate discussion. We would have to get into what it is that we're pulling out, what it is exactly we're pulling out of actual things, how our intellect cooperates with that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess we can go into it. I mean, my position is that there's a cooperation between these universals, which are inherent in actual things, and the intellectual faculty itself.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think there are faculties that we have which have the ability to take individual, what you call sense data,
Mm-hmm.
and yank out a universal.
Yeah.
from that, to yank out these abstractions. So I would agree with you that my conception would have to account for all of that.
Time.
Okay.
Okay, so now we have Classical Theist. You have 5 minutes for your closing statement, beginning now.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that I think if the anti-realist position has any strength at the end of this debate, it would be the notion that to posit common universals would require an additional universal to account for the common universality, by which we say that, for example, redness and humanity are all universals. It seems that my opponent was not able to fully address that problem and fully explain how it is that we can have multiple realities, and then they would have to be realities on the realist view, and yet not have a common universal to account for the to account for the initial universality, and for that reason, I think that, and that of course that would be rather deductive, because it would show that the very idea of realism would ultimately reduce to incoherency on account of the infinite regression issue. And so I think that's the final point that I would make, would simply be to appeal to that argument.
All right, thank you. Now, your final closing statement, Mathoma, with 5 minutes, begins now.
Okay, thank you, Todd. So, I mean, there are a couple of points I'd like to return to in the nominalist picture. I'm still not this problem of having to piggyback upon universals just to adequately articulate his own position. I mean, we saw all through the discussion tonight that classical theist is trying to piggyback on these terms like patterns and arrangements, and it's very difficult to make sense of this nominalistic position if we can't have a guarantee that these things are really instances of something in common. Because if they are not, I mean, this seems to destroy our ability to communicate with one another. I mean, when I use the term pattern, is it the same as when I use the word pattern, or appealing to the thought pattern in the next moment? When I say triangle, is that the same thing as when classical theist utters that word triangle? I mean, if these aren't truly the same, I mean, how can we even have knowledge of? How can we even have knowledge in areas like physics or even in mathematics? Especially, it seems that we can't have knowledge within mathematics, especially because these are necessary truths, and they work mostly with abstractions. So at that point, I'd like to emphasize that that this nominalistic position seems to be quite hostile to science, knowledge, and also communication. Again, this point about having to appeal to more universals and universals upon universals and whatever. I mean, all I'm appealing to is that we abstract these universals from our experience. They are contained in the intellect as abstractions. They can also exist there as abstractions too. But I'm not noticing any other similarities between that. I mean, they're just abstractions in the intellect after that point. Again, I wouldn't assent to the position that these universals can exist just by themselves as forms. I mean, it may be the case that these universals can't exist by themselves. I mean, they can't exist other than their particularizing features or having particulars falling under them. So again, I mean, I would actually agree with classical theist here that the Platonic position might have some flaws with it, but I don't hold this Platonic position. Furthermore, this argument wouldn't establish nominalism either. It wouldn't suggest a position that these universals are just names, or when I say, or universals in quotes, that all these are just names and we're just slapping the same name onto all of them. And again, we're still left to the basic question of why is it that when I see like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I attach the name man onto each one of them. I mean, there seems to be this appeal to phenomenal experience and that the experiences just come together somehow, and that produces the effect. But I mean, that's precisely my point, though. I mean, there seems to be something really in common between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that makes me predicate man of all of them. It makes me slap the name man onto all of them. I mean, this is rather difficult to understand, once again, on this nominalistic position. Whereas it's perfectly accounted for in the realist position, that they all fall under a common universal, namely man. I mean, this comes to the general point that I'd like to emphasize, that this realist position seems to work quite harmoniously with our common experience, and also with high-level science, like in physics, where we have theories about electrons, not just individual electrons, but electrons in general. And I come back to the point that I think these theories owe their predictive power precisely because they are working with universalizing features, not just particular instances. So, I mean, I think science goes way beyond just modeling the data. That this predictive power comes from working with those universalizing features, not just the individuals. And let's see. Again, there's one other point about infinite regress that I'd like to come back to, that the nominalist seems to have to appeal to similarity. But again, we ask, like, why do we recognize the similarities among those similarities? And we have to appeal to higher order names. So it seems like this nominalistic position, it never quite gets off the ground, and never quite escapes this infinite regress. And I think with that, I'd like to end it right there and just thank everyone who participated.
All right. Well, thank you for participating, Classical Theist. Thank you, Mathoma. We should be having an AAR within hopefully 2 weeks on this debate. And this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast.